However, there are two contenders, I think, that have had the most prominent place in this controversy. The theory that Francis Bacon wrote the Shakespeare plays was first advanced in 1856 by Delia Bacon, who, as far as I know, had no relationship to him. But the idea received its greatest impetus in 1888 when Ignatius Donnelly wrote a 2-volume work that ran well over 1,000 pages, which presented the case for Bacon. And that work is still in our library. It's 2 great big volumes. It unfortunately is suffering from what we read about in the paper Sunday, the deterioration of the paper, and I handled it very carefully because the paper was obviously getting very old. But it's a fascinating book to read. I did not read all 1,000 pages, but I did dip into it. What about the dates? Do they fit Bacon? Yes, they do. They fit Bacon very well. He was born in 1561, 3 years before Shakespeare. He died in 1626, 10 years after Shakespeare's death. He was a member of the aristocracy. He was educated at Cambridge. He was a lawyer. He eventually rose to the post of Lord Chancellor. He traveled extensively. He developed the inductive method of reasoning, one of the great philosophical contributions. He was made a peer when he was made the Viscount of St. Albans. He was familiar with the theater because he wrote some theatrical presentations that were produced at his law school, Gray's Inn, and he hired actors in London to perform in those presentations. And interestingly enough, one of the actors that he might have hired was William Shakespeare of Stratford. He wrote extensively, as we all know, under his own name. The most notable are the 58 essays, which are considered masterpieces of their kind, but his other works are so extensive that they fill 20 volumes. He had a very unfortunate experience later in his life as a judge. He was accused of accepting bribes. He pled guilty, and he was imprisoned for a time in the Tower of London. So Francis Bacon was a man who would be very interested in the concept of honor and of his good name, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a theme that we find so often in the Shakespeare plays. Why should we think that Bacon wrote the Shakespeare plays? Well, Ignatius Donnelly says that that proof lies in striking similarities found in such factors in Bacon's works and Shakespeare's works as thoughts, metaphors, opinions, use of words, and so forth. And I must say that some of those parallels are rather breathtaking. For example, Bacon in one of his essays says, "Be so true to thyself as thou be not false to others." And Shakespeare in Hamlet says, "To thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man." In Hamlet we find these lines, "O heavens, a beast that wants discourse of reason would have mourned longer." Talking about it, Hamlet talking about his mother. And that rather peculiar phrase, discourse of reason, occurs several times in Bacon's works. There are other parallels between them. Shakespeare and Bacon were both confirmed punsters, along with Eddie Stashif, I might say. Both misquoted Aristotle. Both entertained false scientific notions, one of them being that life arises from the spontaneous generation of inorganic matter. They believed that the sun revolved around the earth, but who didn't in those days? And then St. Albans, as a place name, occurs a number of times in the Shakespeare plays, and Bacon was the Viscount of St. Albans. What are the objections to the Bacon authorship? A principal objection is that Bacon seemed to lack the poetic genius needed to produce the poems and the plays, and people who believe this point to a translation that he made in poetic form from the Psalms, and they call it a really amateurish production. Also, there is nothing in Bacon's life that can explain the sonnets, which are presumed to be autobiographical. Of course, we can say the same thing about Shakespeare of Stratford. There's nothing in his life that we know about that explains the sonnets. To refute the claim that Bacon could not write in the Shakespeare style, Donnelly arranged the lines from Bacon's essay on death in Shakespearean form. I'm going to read those lines now, and you can judge whether they sound like Shakespeare. Why mourn then for the end that must be, or spend one wish to have a minute added to the uncertain date which marks our years, but marks an alteration only? It is as natural to die as to be born. Does that sound like Shakespeare? That's Francis Bacon. Well, you make up your own mind. How do conventional scholars explain these parallels between Shakespeare and Bacon's works and life? Idiosyncrasies. The usual explanation is that it's merely a coincidence. One objector to the Bacon theory, however, went a step further, a rather nasty little step he took. He said that Bacon attended the Shakespeare plays, and he copied down the good lines, and then he put them into his own works. Donnelly, however, goes further than talking about these similarities to prove that Bacon wrote Shakespeare. He claimed, and I'm sure you've all heard about this, he claimed that he found a cipher that Bacon inserted in the plays to reveal that he was actually the author. In this cipher, according to Donnelly, the word Bacon occurs over and over again. Now, this particular theory rests on the assumption that Bacon had reason to hide his authorship, and yet he would eventually want posterity to know that he had written these wonderful works. Why would Bacon hide the fact that he had written the plays but publish his other works quite openly? Well, perhaps it's the fact that the playwright in those days was not a person who had stood on a very high pedestal. Perhaps Bacon remembered what his mother had once said to him, and she'd upbraided him for mumming and masking and sinfully reveling. She didn't like this interest in the theater that he had. Another reason may have been that Bacon was afraid that the stories about kings that many of the Shakespeare plays tell would get him into political trouble. And as I've already mentioned, he did get into trouble during his career. Donnelly suggests also that he wrote the plays because he wanted the ideas to be remembered and for the benefit of mankind, but was unwilling to acknowledge authorship at that point. And then another idea, which I don't think makes any sense at all, was that Bacon wrote the plays to earn money, that he was always strapped for money. But playwrights really didn't get much money out of writing plays in those days. It's believed that if Shakespeare of Stratford wrote the plays, he did it as a sideline. Isn't that interesting? He did that as a sideline. His main occupation was acting and producing plays. And in order to have material to produce, he said, oh, I'll take a couple of hours and write Hamlet. It's almost incredible, but that may very well be true, that the playwriting was, to a degree at least, a sideline. As Donnelly probed deeper into the cipher, and now, in my view, he gets to be very weird, he discovered that they revealed more than Bacon's name. They told stories that were quite different than the plays themselves, and Donnelly actually records what some of these stories were. And one of the intrigues that he talks about did involve Shakespeare of Stratford. The fact that the cipher is the thing that Donnelly is most interested in is that he called his book The Great Cryptogram, Francis Bacon's Cipher in the so-called Shakespeare plays. As he develops it, he becomes more inconsistent and strange. He began suggesting that Bacon used the cipher because he recognized the quality of his plays and wanted the world to recognize his authorship. And Bacon himself, in his published writings, at one time referred to himself as a concealed poet, and he talked about secret manuscripts, and Donnelly grabs on that as proof that he wrote these secret plays secretly. How do you explain the first folio? That was a big conspiracy in Donnelly's eyes, that Bacon arranged for the publication. He was still alive at the time that it was published. And Ben Jonson had been a secretary to Francis Bacon, so he got him to join in this conspiracy, and then all the others joined in an effort to keep Bacon's authorship a secret and give the credit to Shakespeare of Stratford. Well, a question that arises is, if Bacon wanted his name eventually revealed, why did he create so effective a deception? One thing he kept doing was that he kept switching the nature of the cipher, and so it's very difficult to have it make sense. Incidentally, there's some sense to all this, because Bacon did develop ciphers, and one of them is still used today. It's a very famous cipher, and it's still being used today. Then another major question, I think, about this cipher business is that if he recognized the plays as great works of art, why did he warp and mar them by making changes that he would have to make in order to establish the cipher? He wouldn't be able to choose exactly the right word in some instance, but would have to choose another word in order to make the cipher work. And one of the feelings I always get when I read Shakespeare is that in almost every instance, he used exactly the right word. No other word would have fit as well. Why did Bacon do that? Then he'd have to warp the plays to put the word in a particular location. And Donnelly even suggests that Bacon included useless scenes in order to carry out his cipher. Well, this doesn't seem to be what Donnelly had also said about Bacon, a man who wanted to make the world realize that he had written these great works of art. These two ideas, I think, are in complete opposition, and you can't accept both of them. After Donnelly published his book, other people took up the cause. And they began applying the cipher to other works that were written during the Elizabethan period. And soon the followers of Bacon began claiming that he had written almost everything that was written at that time. For example, the poems of Edmund Spenser, the poems of John Milton, the essays of Montaigne, the Anatomy of Melancholy by Richard Burton, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Bacon wrote all of those. Then it was revealed that the cipher had been applied to the Psalms in the Bible. And it was clear from that cipher that Bacon had also written the Psalms. So it seems that at least dragging the cipher explanation out to this extent surely makes nonsense of it.